I'm indebted to Captain David Coote for. I'd like to talk about the tall white deep space landing area. Once again, you'll notice Dogbone Lake on the right. Notice that even on a hazy day, it's easy to pick out. The deep spacecraft, which the tall whites, bring into the base, routinely come down to, when they come into the Earth, Dogbone Lake is their landing field. And they don't normally touch down at Dogbone Lake unless they're in some kind of trouble or they need to adjust something. Normally, they just come down to the same altitude as the main hangar. Then after they've become stationary and everything is settled down, then they head off to the northwest to where the hangar entrance is. Dogbone Lake runs north and south, okay?
There's no water.
Normally there isn't any water in the dry lake beds, although sometimes in the wintertime or the spring, if you have a big rainstorm, there may be water in the dry lake beds, but normally there isn't. Okay? When you go out to Dogbone Lake, as I have, it's not unusual for there to be absolutely nothing to see. Even if the deep spacecraft have touched down at Dogbone Lake, they may not actually sit down on the ground. They may just come to where they're floating just a few feet above the ground and not leave any footprints or anything behind. They may not actually have disembarked. They might just be stabilizing the propulsion system or stabilizing the fields around them. Now, but notice the distance from Dogbone Lake to Old Range 4 and Old Range 3, which we can remember from the topographical map. That was like 40, 50 miles, and we'll touch on that in a later session since I want to make sure I stay within my time limit. Now, people ask me why I never took pictures of the tall whites, and here's a picture of my wife on her wedding day. And, and so I'd like to give a physical description of the tall whites. Now, well, you'll see my wife looks white, and she has on her wedding gown, and even makes me float out over the people. Meeting the tall whites was always a very emotional experience, even when I got used to it. It took me more than 6 months to get over the fear of meeting the tall whites. We're naturally afraid of them, and you see those desert valleys are very desolate. Being out there like 20 miles, being 20 miles out from any other human at 3 in the morning and having anyone step out of the sagebrush would be frightening. When they're not human and they come in groups, my first reaction was one of panic. When I was a weather observer out at the ranges, the entries in my log books went back 7 years. And during that 7-year period, more than 41 weather observers had been sent to the ranges before me. Before I got there, each weather observer in turn would do 6 weeks of temporary duty, and then each weather observer would take his turn going out there. And that had been going on for as long as the ranges were out there. And of course, a weather observer keeps very extensive log books. You keep the daily log, the weather report log, the inventory log, and so on. And when you read through those log books, each one in turn would start by trying to do his duty. But after just a very few days, sometimes only 2 or 3 days, sometimes a week, sometimes 10 days, they would get compromised. Many would become so afraid of the ranges that they wouldn't go out there. They would literally sit in the chow hall at Indian Springs and make up the weather right out of thin air, Just say, well, I suppose if I were to take the winds, they would say this, Some would try valiantly to do their duty, and they would get so terrified that when they went into Nellis to the neurosurgeon in the base hospital, they would get reassigned to places like Germany or England or Hawaii. Some would be given discharges for, because they couldn't take it anymore. A few had gotten attacked and burned, as I describe in my book. When you're out there and the tall whites come, When you lose your self-control, then if you happen to hit one of the children or one of the tall whites, then they respond the way you and I would respond. It's not pleasant, as I describe in my books. The tall whites have bodies and bones that are thinner than humans. Their skin is as white as a piece of paper. They have larger eyes than humans do. Their eyes are roughly twice the size of our eyes. And when they're young, they're blue and white, just like ours. When you look at them, they look just like people with larger eyes. The eyes spread around the side of their head more than a human's does, and they're very prominent. And their eyesight is as good, at least, as that of a cat. And their hearing is as good, at least, as that of a dog. They're capable of making sounds with their vocal cords that humans can't hear, just the way that I'm told rhinoceroses can do. But they can hear them, and they're well aware of this. When I was out there among them, it wouldn't be uncommon to apparently hear animal sounds out in the sagebrush, sounds like meadowlarks or dogs barking or horses whinnying. Really, it was the aliens. When they would walk in on me, if they felt like just talking between themselves, they were perfectly capable of talking between themselves using sounds too high for me to hear, and they were well aware of that. So they could stand in a line, say, many times, well, just out of hand reach, if I were brave enough to wait for them to come in that close, and it took months for me to get that brave. And it would appear that they weren't talking at all. But in fact, when you watched them, you could see that they were communicating between each other. Okay? Now, they have much less hair than humans do. They don't have any hair on their arms. The hair in their head is only about half the thickness of our hair, and their hair is naturally so thin that it's transparent, so thin and blonde that it's transparent. Sometimes, if you see them out in the sunlight at a distance and they're wearing their hair short, because it grows just like ours does, it'll look as though they don't have any hair. When they do come in close and you see that they do have hair, they'll look naturally platinum blonde. They, throughout most of their life, they're the same height I am, 5'11". They live 10 times longer than humans, and so a normal adult, a normal alien adult, equivalent to a human 21, 22 years old, would be 200, 250 years old. They live about 700 years, give or take, depending on each individual, and they don't age the way humans age. When they get to be equivalent to a human, 39, 40, in there somewhere, they begin growing again. And then they continue growing periodically. They have several other growth phases, and they get taller. So that throughout most of their life, although they're my height, once they start growing again, they can become very tall before they die. It's not unusual to see older tall whites that are 8.5, 9 feet tall. This is not necessarily helpful for them because their bones and skeletons grow, but their internal organs do not grow in proportion. So as they become taller, they become more frail. It was unusual to see a tall white more than 8 feet tall just walking by themselves. By the time they got 8 or 8.5 feet tall, it was the most common thing was to see a younger tall white come and walk beside them to study them because they were becoming more frail and more shaky. By the time they got to be 9 feet tall, it wasn't at all unusual for them to just be, if they were standing somewhere being posted as a guard, for them to stay there until a younger person came to help them walk away. You see in Book 1, in my chapter entitled Millennial Hospitality, for which Book 1 takes its name, the old lady who was a tall white, she was out hiking in the desert with her younger niece, who would stay beside her all the time to study her. You see, the other man that had been out hiking with them, he was willing to allow the old lady to go take her own separate path, only because she wasn't alone, because she had her niece with her. She was very shaky and frail, and a little ditzy too, even for a tall white. And it's kind of like their version of Edith Bunker, as I describe in my book. You know, they the ones that are our height, the young adults, can easily dress up to pass as humans. And when I say easily, I mean from my point of view, it seemed easy enough for them to do that. How it appeared from their point of view is seemed easy enough for them too, for most of them. In Las Vegas, Nevada, especially in the 60s, you know, on Saturday night, along about 11 o'clock, everybody looks a little weird. Half of them look drunk, you know. You see a lot of tourists there that you wonder which part of the world they came from. Well, under the circumstances, see, for a tall white lady to dress up and put on, and for the men to put on sunglasses, well, in Las Vegas, there were a lot of men walking around with sunglasses after 11 o'clock at night, and you didn't go up and push them, or you'd find out which casino they were protecting, you know. Well, see, it was very easy for them to walk into a casino at 11 o'clock at night or 12 o'clock at night and dressed as humans and go totally unnoticed. Remember, the tall whites weren't by themselves. They always came as a group with their guards, and they also typically came with a group of human CIA guards. One night I was standing on the corner outside the Four Queens Hotel and Casino in the summer of 1966, when a group of them came through. First, there was a group of 6 CIA guards, 4 men and 2 women, who came through in the wide perimeter, and the wide perimeter being about a half a block in each direction, and took up positions, you know, just inside the casino, looking out the windows. 2 in the Golden Nugget, a man and a woman, 2 across the street in Binion's Club, 1 down the street to the left of me, you know, a couple in the back, and so on. Then the tall whites came through with their guards, and the tall white guards, of course, were dressed like humans. They were male. And then the 2 women, the teacher and Pamela, came in, and what they were doing was what all tourists do, just enjoying themselves. Well, see, the tall whites, when they came into Las Vegas, they knew perfectly well they were coming into a friendly town. When I was down in the Stardust Hotel and Casino on the Strip, the old Stardust used to have a motif where hanging from the ceiling was fake stars and galaxies and supposedly what it would look like if you were out in space between the stars. The tall whites loved to come in and see that. They thought it was really entertaining because they'd been out between the stars. They said, oh, that's what humans think it looks like, you know. Well, the CIA had kind of established that casino in that area as a friendly part of town. So they had, you know, a pit boss and a team of dealers and a couple of lady CIA guards who would function as Keno girls. And at any time at all, the CIA team could come in and replace the regular pit boss and guards and just be dealing at the table, and or handling the crap table, or watching the showboat across the street, or a casino, and so on, and just making sure that nothing unexpected happened. And then when the tall whites came in, for example, one day when they came in at 4 a.m. on Sunday morning, they were just friends, you know, they were just friendly guys around, so that, you know, if you were to ever try to go up to one of the tall whites, you would discover that the CIA guards would muscle you out, you know, unless they knew, you know, and you could go up there, and of course they knew me in those days, and so, you know, the stories they would tell would be kind of interesting. And although, you know, the CIA guards were never very talkative, you know, they'd always want you to just pretend they were ordinary, you know, and that was kind of hard. The one way I used to pick them out was that because the tall whites are thinner than we are, the one thing they can't disguise is the way they walk. They walk differently than humans. They come from a planet that is much larger than the Earth, has a stronger gravitational field, and when they walk, they naturally, once you get the idea of just standing and looking at a crowd in Las Vegas, as I did, at night, and just watching the crowd silhouetted against some distant lights, you can pick them right out if they're there, because they shuffle when they walk, you know. The gait is just simply different than that of a human, because they don't full stride the way we do and stuff. And I can answer that more in the question and answer session, since I want to make sure I don't go over. Meeting the tall whites was always a very emotional experience, even when I knew they were friendly and that they hadn't come to hurt me, because they're not human. They sometimes in the wintertime or the spring, if you have a big rainstorm, There may be water in the dry lake beds, but normally there isn't. Okay? When you go out to Dogbone Lake, as I have, it's not unusual for there to be absolutely nothing to see. Even if the deep spacecraft have touched down at Dogbone Lake, they may not actually sit down on the ground. They may just come to where they're floating just a few feet above the ground and not leave any footprints or anything behind. They may not actually have disembarked. They might just be stabilizing the propulsion. And so I'd like to give a physical description of the tall whites. Now, well, you'll see my wife looks white, and she has on her wedding gown, and even makes me float out over the people. Meeting the tall whites was always a very emotional experience, even when I got used to it. It took me more than 6 months to get over the fear of meeting the tall whites. We're naturally afraid of them, system or stabilizing the fields around them. Now, but notice the distance from Dogbone Lake to Old Range 4 and Old Range 3, which we can remember from the topographical map. That was like 40, 50 miles, and we'll touch on that in a later session, since I want to make sure I stay within my time limit. Now, people ask me why I never took pictures of the tall whites, and here's a picture of my wife on her wedding day. And they don't normally touch down at Dogbone Lake unless they're in some kind of trouble or they need to adjust something. Normally they just come down to the same altitude as the main hangar. Then after they've become stationary and settled, everything is settled down, then they head off to the northwest where the hangar entrance is. Dogbone Lake runs north and south, okay?
There's no water.
Normally there isn't any water in the dry lake beds, although I'm indebted to Captain David Coote for. I'd like to talk about the tall white deep space landing area. Once again, you'll notice Dogbone Lake on the right. Notice that even on a hazy day, it's easy to pick out. The deep spacecraft, which the tall whites, bring into the base, routinely come down to, when they come into the Earth, Dogbone Lake is their landing field. And